Hello folks, this is Perry Hartman with Painter's Dream Productions, and it is a privilege and an honor to be sitting today with Mr. Ed Butler, who is the author of Memory Lane Was a Gravel Road for 8 Generations, and he has released his second edition, and I felt it was necessary in order to properly not only promote this book, but to create pieces of opportunity for people to learn about his history as well as their own. And Ed, I just wanted to first of all thank you for taking the time to meet with all of us today. How are you today?
Well, I'm doing very well.
Why don't you take a few minutes and share with those that are watching about why you first wrote the first edition, and then we will of course get into the purpose of writing the second edition.
Okay. Well, my father was a most unusual individual. He was born in 1897. His mother died the day after his 10th birthday. And he's the only man I ever knew that lived and traveled in a covered wagon. He's the only man I ever knew that bought and trained and worked oxen. And he had a lot of unusual experiences. And a lot of the experiences he had, I have learned since I wrote that first edition, are experiences other people's ancestors had, because they all had to struggle for a living in those days. But Dad, in spite of the fact that he didn't have much education, he never got to school regular after his mama died, but he loved to tell stories and he loved history. And all my life, till he died in 1995, when we got together Christmas, my sisters and I, Dad always would tell stories from his memory. He never wrote anything down. But when he died, do not share my love for history, but are always interested in hearing the stories, would want me to tell stories when the three of us were together for Christmas. And it was a privilege, and I had loved it, and when Dad told the stories, I remembered a lot of it, and I always told Dad stories at Christmas. Well, I was urged, almost threatened for several years by my sisters to write those stories down. And rather than have a bunch of different essays or notes, various links and whatever, I decided to write a book. And this book has a number of stories about my dad. I included stories about my grandparents, my great-grandfather, an interesting story that Dad told about him, and then some of Mother's people and a story or two about my mother, who was a school teacher in a one-room log schoolhouse. But I visited the year after I wrote the book and had it published. I visited with my sisters again at Christmas. We have now had 73 Christmases together. Never missed a Christmas. But when we sat...
Wait. 73? Now wait a second.
Day after Christmas. And my parents, we had them for both of us till my parents died.
By the way, that is Mrs. Butler, who you hear.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, that's all right. But my whole point of 73, sir, you maybe look about 63 or 64 years old. I don't think anybody would believe that you're in your 70s. Is that possible?
Well, according to my driver's license and my birth certificate, it's real.
Wow. Well, first of all, and I mean, not only does your book include stories, but it also includes a lot of pictures. And I think what fascinated me most about this book was that you were able to get pictures of items that I never even in my life knew what these things were, simply because when I grew up, I was never taught it. So spend a few moments in sharing with me and those who are watching about how you put together these pictures and why you included them in this book.
Well, the old saying that a picture's worth 1,000 words is certainly true when you're describing one of these old items that most people that ever read this book have never seen. I would not, had I not been raised by the old gentleman that raised me. But he never threw anything away. When my mother died, it took my sisters and I 3 days to clean the house out because they hadn't thrown anything away in the 50-some years they'd been married. I not only was fortunate enough to know what these items were, when my mother died, and she died 10 years, more than 10 years before Dad did, but Dad decided he would have to move to live with one of us 3 children. I had 8 acres, a little over 8 acres in Louisiana, had a garden, 3 boys for him to help take care of and whatever. One of my sisters lives in Dallas, and he never did like Dallas. And one of my sisters lived at Evansville, Indiana. But he decided Cooley Crossing Road in Woodworth, Louisiana would be a good place to live. So when he got his items together for a sale, he sold all of his farm equipment, household goods that my sisters and I didn't want. And we got to pick and choose everything we wanted. Well, I was the only member of the family that wanted the hay fork that I saw him use when I was a little boy. I was the only member of the family that wanted some of the items in this room that are pictured in the book. But I kept all that because they were treasures to me because they spoke of the past. And I had a family member make the pictures. They're not maybe professionally done, but then that's all right because they're not professional items. They're items that were used and cherished and needed by previous generations.
What I found so fascinating about this book, first of all, for those of you that have not seen this book yet, this book is a little under 240 pages, and it's, of course, it's a very easy read simply because it tells about a lot of wonderful stories that you and your family experienced, and I'm just gonna pick out a few chapters here and have you talk a little bit about them simply because their titles within themselves speak volumes. Now, I can't help it, but I have to start with the first one that says, Moving to Kentucky. Where were you born and raised at, sir?
Well, I was born and raised in West Kentucky, about 50 miles south of Paducah and a mile and a quarter north of the Kentucky-Tennessee state line. That chapter tells about my 5th or 6th great-grandfather. I have to look to remember for sure. He and 6 or 8 other families left Virginia in 1821 to homestead land in Kentucky. And they crossed the Cumberland and the Tennessee River into what is today called the Purchase District of Kentucky, and found good alluvial soil, creek bottoms along creeks and whatever, and they decided that was where they were going to homestead. And I've got records going back to 1821 of the Butlers in West Kentucky. The gentleman that moved, Robert Butler is his name, it's mentioned in the book, 5th or 6th great-grandfather. The first thing they did was clear a little spot for a garden. After that, they cleared more land for corn and pasture because they had livestock with them. They had cows and horses and maybe other livestock, which they had to feed their livestock as well as themselves. But my grandfather went to the house for dinner, such a house as such it was. It probably wasn't anything but a one-room log cabin. But he went there for dinner one day after clearing land and ate dinner, went back to the woods where he was clearing stumps and roots and whatever, and disappeared. He was never seen or heard of again. And they were on the banks of the Bayou de Cheyenne, or Bayou de Chay, as people in West Kentucky call it, the Bayou de Chay Creek, which was a major waterway for Native Americans in that part of Kentucky for years. And the assumption was made that the Native Americans captured him and carried him off. But he had enough sons. I think there were 7 boys in his family, and he had enough family members to go ahead and make a crop, and with the help of the other families that moved there, the Butlers survived in Hickman County, Kentucky.
Camping in comfort.
Well, I mentioned that Dad lived and traveled in a covered wagon. And in 1906, my grandmother was dying of TB. And in those days, there was no penicillin, no antibiotic, and the doctors did not know what to do to stop what was almost a death sentence. Few people survived tuberculosis. But he recommended they go to a TB sanitarium that he'd read about in Comfort, Texas. So my grandfather and grandmother sold their farm, and her brother and his wife and 2 boys sold their farm, and they caught a riverboat at Hickman, Kentucky, went to either Vicksburg or Natchez, and Dad never was sure which town. He couldn't say. I think it was Vicksburg, because in those days, according to old maps, there was a railroad running west. After you crossed the Mississippi River at Vicksburg, you could take a rail car and ride all the way to San Antone. In San Antone, they bought 2 covered wagons, a 1-horse and a 2-horse wagon, and 3 horses, and supplies, and a cast iron stove, and it took them 2 days to go to Comfort, Texas. They camped on the banks of the Guadalupe River, stayed there 9 months. My grandmother didn't want to die what we always joked about being a foreign country, or Texas, and they moved back to West Kentucky in late February 2007, and she died the 6th day of March, the day after my dad's birthday. But he actually lived and traveled in a covered wagon.
A mother's work.
Well, I'll tell a very interesting story there. My mother didn't care about her family history. Well, she didn't remember it. She cared about it, and yet she wasn't a historian like my father. And I've never heard her tell the story of her teaching school at Austin Springs, Tennessee, a little town that just about doesn't exist this day and time. But there was a TB sanitarium there, and a hotel or 2, and and a little school. And she got a 2-year teacher's certificate at Murray State University, and got a job teaching in Weakley County, Tennessee, at Austin Springs, and it was a 1 through 8 school. She had been warned by the Pointers, Mr. Pointer and Miss Pointer, had warned her when she took the job that the McLean boys had run off the last 2 teachers at that school. And she boarded with them, and I'm sure they talked about the McLean boys. They were big. I think the oldest one, Dad thought at least, that he was 17 or 18 years old. But they would come to school in December. They had to farm, they had to strip tobacco, and when all that was done and the winter, the crops were put away and the winter time had arrived, they would usually show up at school. And sure enough, one day they showed up at school. The oldest one, the biggest one, was throwing paper wads and talking and interrupting Mother's class. And that kind of irritated my mother. She was Scotch. She was quick to anger, but quick to get over it. But she didn't want anybody interrupting her classroom. And she called the McLean boy to the front of the room, reached in the chalkboard behind her chair, and got a big tobacco stick that she'd gotten from Mr. Pointer's tobacco barn. And she brought the McLean boy to his knees. And when she had relieved some of her frustrations, she told him to get up and go to his seat, or get up and go home. It was his choice. But if he stayed, he had to behave. And I understand, at least Dad thought, he went to school that winter until it was time to plow ground and start another crop year. But she was a hard worker. I tell a very interesting story about her helping Dad save Lespedeza seed. And I'm not going to tell you what Lespedeza is. But she canned, she gardened, she worked hard as a mother, a wife, and kept us all fed, kept us in clothes, and was a very good mother.
Fighting for their freedoms.
Well, that's a controversial topic this day and time. I had 4 ancestors on my father's side and 2 on my mother's side that fought in the Confederate Army. None of my dad's ancestors had ever owned a slave. They were dirt farmers. And they didn't rush off to war initially. One of them tried to and was refused. They didn't let him join the Confederate Army when he tried to. But they joined the Confederate Army to protect family, fireside, and faith. And 3 of the 4 of my dad's ancestors rode with General Nathan Bedford Forrest for 2.5 years. I tell a few stories about how much fun it wasn't to ride with General Forrest. They suffered saddle sores and worn out clothes and hunger, long hours. They didn't have a bit of fun for the 2.5 years they were in the cavalry. But they followed what is considered, well, it was until political correctness took over, was considered to be the greatest horse soldier that ever straddled a horse.
I now want to go to the back of the book. And I'm going to read a paragraph. And then I'd like for you to comment on it. It says, the willingness of 2 wonderful friends to come to my rescue at a moment's notice, to put my needs above their own, and to work in the humid, pest-infested South Georgia summertime is incredible. All of the people that helped me did so without expecting anything in return. What I didn't realize until I was able to reflect on my experiences is that God had already positioned these people to take care of me before I ever knew I needed them. Sometimes we lose focus and just need to be reminded of God's power.
Well, there are 3 parts, actually 4 parts of the book that I did not write. That comes from the last chapter, which is modern history. 13 June 2013, our oldest son got in his airplane, which was at Livingston, Tennessee. He had it sold in Clearwater, Florida, with the understanding he would deliver it. And it was a beautiful sunny day, just perfect for flying. He was over South Georgia when the motor went to sputtering, and just a few seconds in, locked up. He could not see anything that was an attractive spot to land an airplane. His only option really was a cotton field. The cotton was about boot-top high, and the dirt had been plowed recently, cultivated recently, and he knew it was not an ideal place to land a plane, but he had no choice. He went through the procedure that his instructor had been over several times, what to do in such an emergency. And he cut the ignition off, and he cut the gas off, and whatever the instructor had told him to do. And he sat back in his chair and said, "Help me, God." God put that airplane on the ground and did not allow it to roll, to tumble. And it's the tumbling that just about always kills the occupants of an airplane. And the fact that God put that on the ground in one piece is just nothing but an act of God. And he had 2 friends that left here that afternoon, late that afternoon. That was late morning. He had two friends that left here late that afternoon in a truck. One of them had an automobile carrier, a big trailer, and they went to Tifton, Georgia, where they spent the night, and helped him take the wings off the plane and bring it back after a FAA inspector had written up a report. And they are still his valuable friends.
For those who are watching this video who are going to be part of the 8 generations after you, and one of the reasons why I know God put us together was for me to capture moments like this, not only on video, but to make sure that your story continues on. What do you want the future generations, the future Butlers, and the future family members to know about their history?
Well, all of my close kin owns a copy of the first edition. I've not given them a copy of the second edition. I don't know. They're still young, got families, extremely busy. I understand that. I went through all that, but fortunately I got to retire. I lived long enough to retire. But I want them to know this, to be able to pass it on to their generation and those folks to the next generation and so forth. And I think most people value their family history. And for the people watching this little video, let me urge you to either get a recorder or a pencil and paper and sit down and talk to the oldest members of your family and get their stories. Because every one of you has got stories. If you've got people alive that lived through what I've told, they did a lot of the same things my ancestors did. And I really think all of our history is worthy of being recorded.
At the end of the book, you have a sincere thanks. And one of the most touching thanks is towards the bottom of page 236 that says, "My best friend and wife of 51 years is due much gratitude and appreciation. Through this entire process, she has offered much encouragement and has made many worthy suggestions. Thanks, Pat." Tell me about your perception of her experience in you writing this book.
Well, Pat is a very even-tempered, easy to get along with individual. And I guess there are wives, I don't have that kind, that would have gotten totally out of patience with me doing little or nothing some days, but sitting in my easy chair pecking on that little computer. But she helped in many ways. You know, the story that Dad wrote about the greatest day of his life was, I don't know how I managed to forget it, but it's now on, going to be on my website and it's on Facebook. She found that in some of her stuff. And I didn't think about it when I was writing the book, but it's certainly a part of Dad's history and something that I'm glad she found and has willingly helped me just steadily ever since this process began. And it's been a long, difficult job. I didn't realize how big a job it was till I decided to do this, but I'm glad I did.
So, in other words, the statement that says, "Behind every good man is a woman winking," stands true here, doesn't it?
For sure.
Ed, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this video. It is history. It's your story, it's your family's story, and look forward to the day that those who are not familiar with your history and the history that you grew up with, that they can share their love for this book. And you've been given a wonderful opportunity to capture a moment in time, and I just wanted you to know how grateful and thankful we are that you've done this.
I'm glad God made it possible.